She thought the deafening bass of the club would swallow the insult. Cornutu e malumenutu, Camilla muttered under her breath, turning her back to the leather-clad VIP booth. She shouldn't have said it. But her feet ached. She hadn't slept in 2 days, and his casual arrogance was suffocating. She took one step away before a heavy hand closed around her elbow. The music seemed to mute. Dante leaned down, the faint scent of gun oil and expensive vetiver washing over her. He grinned. "Say that again, but looking at me." The bass in L'Ombra didn't just play. It vibrated through the floorboards and rattled the ice in overpriced glasses. Camilla Rossi stood near the edge of the VIP section, her arms crossed tightly over a trench coat that had seen better winters. She looked entirely out of place among the silk slips and tailored suits, and she didn't care. She was here to collect a debt. 2 nights ago, a man had bled all over her linoleum floor. He was a mountain of a guy with a shattered collarbone and a bullet lodged uncomfortably close to his femoral artery. He hadn't gone to an emergency room because guys who worked for Dante Costa didn't do emergency rooms. They did basement clinics. They did off-the-books cash drops. They did Camilla because she was quiet, fast, and didn't ask why there was drywall dust and brain matter on their shoes. She saved the man's life. It took 4 hours of grueling, meticulous work under harsh fluorescent lights that hummed like angry hornets. When the sun came up, the man's friends hauled him out, tossed a thin envelope of cash on her stainless steel tray, and vanished. The envelope contained exactly 1/3 of her standard hazard rate. Camilla wasn't stupid. You didn't walk into a mob front in downtown Chicago to demand a few grand unless you had a death wish or a very specific kind of exhaustion. Camilla had the latter. The rent on the clinic was due, the medical suppliers were threatening to cut off her anesthetics, and she was running on 4 hours of sleep spread over 3 days. Desperation made a mockery of fear, so she waited. The bouncers had patted her down, sneered at her scuffed boots, and told her to stand by the velvet rope until the boss had a minute. That was an hour ago. She watched Dante Costa from across the room. He sat in the center of the booth, surrounded by a rotating cast of sycophants and women who looked like they were constructed in a high-end laboratory. Dante wasn't a cartoon mobster. There were no fedoras, no cigars, no loud velvet tracksuits. He wore a dark, bespoke suit with the top 2 buttons of his shirt undone. He looked like a Wall Street predator, save for the stillness in his eyes. It was a cold, predatory quiet. He didn't fidget. He didn't laugh at the jokes his lieutenants told. He just watched the room. Finally, a massive man with a scarred jaw, Leo, she remembered his name was Leo, nodded at her and unclipped the rope. Camilla walked forward, keeping her spine rigid. The air in the booth was thick with the smell of expensive whiskey and melting wax from the table candles. Dante didn't look up immediately. He was swirling an amber liquid in a crystal glass, his attention ostensibly on the ice. "You're the doctor," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that cut perfectly through the club's heavy bass. He didn't phrase it as a question. "I'm a licensed trauma surgeon, yes," Camilla said, keeping her tone flat. "And I run a private practice. A practice that your man nearly bled out in 48 hours ago." Dante finally looked at her. His eyes were a pale, striking grey, stark against his dark hair and olive skin. He looked her up and down, a slow, clinical assessment that made her skin prickle. "He left you an envelope. I was told you were compensated." "He left me a joke," Camilla replied, pulling a folded piece of paper from her pocket and dropping it on the low table between them. "That's an itemized invoice. It includes the cost of the blood I had to source on short notice, the surgical supplies, the biohazard cleanup, and the premium for my absolute silence." The envelope barely covered the blood. One of the men flanking Dante laughed. It was a harsh, mocking sound. Dante just held up a single finger, and the laughter died instantly. He leaned forward, picking up the piece of paper. He glanced at it, not really reading the numbers, then dropped it back onto the table. "You're charging a premium for silence. That implies if I don't pay this, you'll talk. It implies that my silence is a service you purchase, Mr. Costa," she said, her heart hammering against her ribs. She kept her face perfectly still. "If you don't value the service, you shouldn't use my clinic. But you already used it." "I expect to be paid for the work I did." Dante stared at her. The silence stretched, tight and dangerous. The ambient noise of the club felt miles away. "I think," he said slowly, "you're overestimating your value, Doctor. You patched a hole. A mechanic does the same thing to a tire. You got paid mechanic's wages. Be grateful you got that, and go home." He dismissed her by looking away, lifting his glass to take a sip. It was the casual disrespect, the utter disregard for her skill and her desperation, that snapped the last frayed wire in Camilla's exhausted brain. She turned around, her jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached. She thought the deafening bass of the club would swallow the insult. "Cornutu e maluminutu," Camilla muttered in her grandfather's native tongue under her breath, turning her back to the leather-clad VIP booth. She shouldn't have said it, but she was tired, her feet ached, and his arrogance was suffocating. She took one step away before a heavy hand closed around her elbow. The music seemed to mute. Dante Costa stepped into her space, leaning down, the faint scent of gun oil and expensive vetiver washing over her. He grinned, a flash of white teeth that held no warmth at all. "Say that again." "But looking at me." Camilla froze. The grip on her elbow wasn't bruising, but it was absolute. It was the grip of a man who knew exactly how much force was required to control a situation, and not an ounce more. She didn't try to pull away. That would show panic. Instead, she turned her head, tipping her chin up to meet his gaze. Close up, the grey of his eyes was almost metallic. "I think you heard me fine," she said. Her voice was steady, even if her stomach was twisting into tight, cold knots. Dante's grin widened by a fraction of an inch. The amusement in his expression was genuine now, replacing the bored indifference from moments ago. He didn't let go of her arm. Instead, he shifted his grip, his long fingers wrapping loosely around her wrist, and began walking toward the back of the club. "Hey!" Camilla started, stumbling slightly in her boots as she was forced to follow his long strides. "Leo!" Dante called out over his shoulder, not breaking his pace. "Bring the invoice." They bypassed the crowded dance floor, stepping through a heavy, unmarked velvet curtain, and then another set of solid steel doors. The transition was jarring. The moment the steel doors clicked shut behind them, the relentless pounding of the bass was cut off completely, replaced by the hushed, expensive quiet of thick carpets and soundproofed walls. Dante released her wrist as they stepped into a massive office. The room was dominated by a dark oak desk and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. It smelled of old paper, leather polish, and unlit cigars. He walked around the desk, shucking off his suit jacket and tossing it over the back of a leather chair. Camilla rubbed her wrist, standing awkwardly near the door. Was the manhandling necessary? "You insulted me in a language I haven't heard since my grandmother died," Dante said, pouring himself a short glass of water from a carafe on his desk. He didn't offer her any. "I wanted to ensure we had privacy for the rest of this conversation. Sit." He pointed to one of the leather chairs opposite his desk. "I'd rather stand," Camilla said. "And I'd rather just take my money and leave. I don't want any trouble. You came into my club and called me a cursed bastard in front of my men," Dante said smoothly, leaning against the edge of his desk and crossing his ankles. "Trouble is already here, Dr. Rossi." Sit down." She hesitated, then walked over and sat on the very edge of the chair, keeping her back ramrod straight. She didn't want to sink into the plush leather. She wanted to remain ready to bolt. A quiet knock sounded at the door. It opened, and Leo stepped in, completely silent despite his size. He placed the folded piece of paper on Dante's desk, gave Camilla a blank look, and backed out of the room, closing the door softly. Dante picked up the invoice. This time he actually read it. His eyes tracked down the itemized list, his expression unreadable. $17,000, he read aloud. That's standard for a gunshot wound requiring general anesthesia, extraction, and post-op stabilization without a paper trail, Camilla said defensively. Is it? Dante set the paper down. You know, the last guy we used charged a flat $5,000, and the last guy you used is currently serving 10 to 20 in a federal penitentiary because he left bloody gauze in his dumpster and kept a ledger in his glove box, Camilla shot back. I don't leave traces. I don't keep ledgers. I burned your man's clothes and bleached my floor so thoroughly I gave myself a migraine. You pay for the medical expertise, Mr. Costa. You pay extra for the ghost. Dante watched her. He was dissecting her, tearing away the bravado to see what was underneath. Camilla forced herself to hold his gaze. She was exhausted, practically vibrating with caffeine and stress, but she refused to blink first. You're bold for someone who works in a basement, Dante noted softly. Desperation looks a lot like boldness if the lighting is bad. It slipped out before she could stop it. A moment of bitter honesty. Dante's eyes narrowed slightly, catching the thread of truth. He reached into the top drawer of his desk and pulled out a thick stack of $100 bills bound by a paper band. He tossed it onto the desk. It hit the wood with a heavy, satisfying thud. 20,000, Dante said. Camilla stared at the money. It was more than enough. It was rent, supplies, and breathing room for 3 months. She didn't reach for it. Why 20? Consider the extra 3,000 a retainer, Dante said, pushing away from the desk and walking slowly around to her side. He stopped just behind her chair. She could feel the heat radiating from him. My organization is undergoing restructuring. I'm taking over territories that belonged to men who don't want to give them up. That means more bullets, more broken bones. I told you, I'm a doctor, not an employee. You're a contractor, Dante corrected, his voice a low rumble just above her ear. And from now on, you're an exclusive contractor. You don't work for anyone else in this city. You don't fix up any rival crews. When my men get hurt, they go to you. When you need supplies, you give Leo the list, and we procure them. Camilla gripped the arms of the chair. I can't run a clinic like that. If I stop taking my regular cash patients, people will notice. Your regular cash patients are junkies and battered wives, Dante said coldly. Keep treating them. I don't care about them. I'm talking about the underworld, Camilla. You belong to me now. The use of her first name sent a sharp spike of adrenaline through her chest. She stood up, turning to face him. They were too close. She had to crane her neck to look him in the eye. I don't belong to anyone, she said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. I take the money on the desk. We're square for last night, and we go our separate ways. Dante didn't move back. He looked down at her, the ghost of that dangerous grin returning to his lips. You can walk out that door with the 20,000, but if you do, understand this. The next time a man bleeds on your linoleum, he'll be one of mine. And if you turn him away, I won't be paying you a visit to discuss invoices. He reached past her, picking up the stack of bills, and pressed it firmly into her hand. His fingers were warm and calloused, lingering against her skin for a second too long. Go home and sleep, Doctor, Dante said quietly. You look like hell, and you have a lot of work coming up. The $20,000 sat inside a sterile specimen box on the bottom shelf of Camilla's supply closet. It felt less like a safety net, and more like a live grenade. For the first 4 days after her meeting at Lombra, the clinic remained quiet. She paid her back rent in cash, ignoring the landlord's suspicious stare. She restocked her fentanyl, her surgical mesh, and her heavy-duty antibiotics through a grey market supplier in Detroit. The rest of the money stayed in the plastic box, mocking her every time she opened the door for gauze. Normalcy tried to return. She stitched up a baker who had slipped with a bread knife. She set a fractured radius for a 12-year-old girl who had taken a bad spill off a skateboard, accepting 2 Tupperwares of homemade lasagna from the mother as payment. It was quiet. It was almost peaceful. Camilla knew it was a lie. The illusion shattered on a Tuesday at 3 in the morning. The heavy iron buzzer at the alley entrance didn't just ring. Someone leaned on it, sending a continuous, grating screech echoing through the basement clinic. Camilla jerked awake from the cot in her office. She didn't bother changing out of her scrubs. She grabbed the heavy metal flashlight she kept by the pillow and walked down the short, linoleum-tiled hallway. She checked the security monitor. It was Leo. He was alone, but he was half carrying, half dragging a body. Camilla hit the release button and shoved the heavy steel door open. The metallic scent of blood hit her before they even crossed the threshold. It was thick and hot, cutting through the crisp autumn air. "Get him to room 2, Camilla ordered, stepping back. Leo grunted, hauling the man inside. It wasn't a man, it was a kid. He looked barely 19, wearing a black track jacket that was soaked through and sticking to his skin. His head lolled against Leo's massive shoulder, his face the color of wet ash. "Table," Camilla said, moving faster now. She kicked the door shut and engaged the deadbolt. Leo heaved the kid onto the stainless steel surgical table. The boy let out a wet, breathless sound. Camilla was already moving, snapping on a pair of nitrile gloves and pulling the rolling tray of sterilized instruments closer. "What happened?" she asked. She didn't look at Leo. She grabbed a pair of trauma shears and began cutting away the ruined track jacket. "Drive by," Leo said. His voice was a flat, unbothered rumble. He was on a corner in the south end. Rival crew rolled up. Caught 2 in the abdomen. "Name?" "Nico." "All right, Nico. Stay with me," Camilla muttered, peeling the fabric back. The smell of perforated bowels and copper filled the small room. It was a gut wound, messy, dangerous. "Leo, go wash your hands at the scrub sink. I need you to hold pressure while I push the anesthesia. He's crashing." To his credit, the giant didn't argue. He moved to the sink and scrubbed aggressively. Camilla hooked Nico up to the monitors. His heart rate was a frantic, fluttering bird on the screen, his blood pressure plummeting. She found a viable vein in his left arm and pushed a rapid sequence induction dose. "Press here," Camilla instructed, guiding Leo's massive hands over the packed gauze on Nico's stomach. "Harder. Don't let up until I tell you." The next 3 hours were a blur of intense, mechanical focus. Camilla stopped being a tired woman in a basement and became a machine. She suctioned away the pooling blood, fighting through the slick, dark mess to find the damaged vessels. One bullet had passed clean through, missing the liver by a fraction of an inch. The second was lodged deep in the abdominal wall, having shredded a section of the small intestine on its way in. She clamped, sutured, and repaired. The harsh fluorescent lights beat down on her, sweat stinging her eyes. She didn't wipe it away. She operated in absolute silence, broken only by the rhythmic, synthetic beep of the heart monitor and the wet sounds of surgery. Leo stood in the corner the entire time. He didn't speak. He just watched her work, his heavy arms crossed over his chest, By the time Camilla dropped the last bloody clamp into the metal basin, her shoulders were screaming in agony. She sutured the incision with rapid, precise movements, applied a sterile dressing, and stepped back. Nico was stable. Barely. But he was alive. Camilla stripped off her blood-soaked gloves and tossed them into the biohazard bin. She leaned over the scrub sink, turning the hot water on, full blast. She pumped coarse soap into her hands and scrubbed until her skin was raw and pink. She watched the water swirl down the drain, turning from crimson to pale pink to clear. "He'll live," Camilla said to the mirror, not looking at Leo's reflection. "But he needs a hospital. I don't have an ICU here. If he goes septic, he's dead." "He stays here," a new voice said. Camilla froze. She turned around slowly, drying her hands on a rough paper towel. Dante Costa was leaning against the door frame of the operating room. He wore a dark cashmere overcoat, his hands buried deep in the pockets. He looked completely out of place against the backdrop of peeling paint and sterile steel. He looked at the unconscious boy on the table, then shifted his pale grey eyes to Camilla. "He stays," Dante repeated, "and you keep him alive." "I'm a surgeon, not a miracle worker," Camilla said, tossing the paper towel into the trash. She walked past Dante, deliberately brushing too close to his shoulder to assert her space in the cramped room. "He has a perforated bowel. I repaired it. But the risk of infection is massive. If he spikes a fever, I can push broad-spectrum antibiotics. But if he needs life support, I have nothing." Dante turned, following her into the small adjacent office. The room was barely large enough for a desk, a filing cabinet, and a battered leather sofa. "Then make sure he doesn't need it," Dante said simply. He walked over to the desk and looked down at her haphazardly organized medical journals and empty coffee cups. "You took the money, Camilla. This is the job. The job was fixing your broken men," she snapped, her exhaustion boiling over into anger. "It wasn't running a black site recovery ward. I need sleep. I need help. I'm one person." Dante didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Leo will stay. He can lift the boy, handle the perimeter, and fetch whatever you need. But Nico doesn't leave this basement. The police are looking for a gunshot victim from the South End shootout. If he walks into a real ER, he gets cuffed to the bed. Then he talks." "He's a kid," Camilla said, pointing a finger toward the operating room. "Why is a kid standing on a corner catching bullets for you? He's 19. In my world, that makes him a man," Dante replied. He finally took his hands out of his pockets, unbuttoning his overcoat. He sat down on the battered leather sofa, looking entirely too comfortable. He chose the life. He knew the risks. Just like you chose to open a cash-only clinic in a neighborhood where the cops don't patrol. Camilla crossed her arms, leaning against the edge of her desk. "Don't equate my clinic with your racket. I save lives. You ruin them," Dante chuckled. It was a dark, dry sound. "We both profit off the desperation of others, Doctor. You just get to wear a white coat while you do it." The truth of the statement stung, burying itself under her ribs. She hated that he could see right through her moral grandstanding. She was operating a rogue clinic because she had lost her license at a major hospital, a detail she was certain Dante already knew. He didn't do business with ghosts without running a background check. "Why are you here, Dante?" she asked, dropping the formalities. The exhaustion stripped away her filter. "You don't strike me as the type to personally check on a low-level runner at 4 in the morning." Dante held her gaze. The silence stretched between them, heavy and loaded. He looked at her blood-stained scrubs, her messy hair pulled back in a frantic bun, the dark circles under her eyes. "I came to see my investment," he said quietly. "Nico." "You." Camilla felt a cold shiver trace the line of her spine. "I'm not an investment. I'm a service provider. You're an anchor, Dante corrected him. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I told you things are shifting. The men I'm dealing with don't play by the old rules. They hit runners. They hit families. My crew needs to know that if they take a bullet for me, they don't bleed out in an alley. They need to know I have the best hands in the city waiting to put them back together. And you decided those were mine. I saw what you did for Marcus last week. I saw what you just did for Nico, Dante said. He stood up slowly, closing the distance between them. The office was too small. He was too large. You have steady hands, Camilla. And don't panic. I value that. He was standing inches from her now. She could smell the cold night air clinging to his coat, mixed with that same sharp vetiver. She refused to step back. She tilted her chin up, meeting his eyes with open defiance. Value it all you want, she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. But don't mistake my competence for loyalty. I do this for the money. The second you stop paying, or the second the heat gets too high, I'm gone. Dante reached out. Camilla flinched internally but held her ground. He didn't grab her. He just lightly brushed a stray lock of hair away from her cheek. His touch was shockingly gentle, entirely at odds with the violence of his world. You won't leave, Dante said softly, his thumb lingering near her jaw for a fraction of a second. Why? Because you'll kill me? Because you need the chaos just as much as I do, Dante murmured. He stepped back, the brief moment of intimacy vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. He turned toward the door. Leo has my number. Call if his temperature spikes. Otherwise, I'll see you when the sun goes down. He walked out, the heavy steel door clicking shut behind him. Camilla stood alone in the quiet office. She pressed 2 fingers against her own pulse point on her neck. It was racing. She looked down at her hands, still raw and red from the hot water. She hated that he was right. The clinic smelled of bleach, stale coffee, and the cloying, sweet scent of decaying tissue. Time in the basement didn't pass in days or nights. It passed in shifts of agonizing routine. Check the vitals. Flush the IV. Change the dressing. Sleep for 20 minutes on the rigid cot until the alarm vibrated against Camilla's chest. Wake up. Repeat. For 3 days, Nico hovered in a twilight state between life and a very quiet death. Leo proved to be an unexpected asset. The massive enforcer didn't complain about the smell or the cramped conditions. He sat on a metal folding chair outside the operating room, a loaded Glock resting on his thigh, reading worn paperback westerns. When Camilla needed a heavy lift to turn Nico and prevent bed sores, Leo moved the teenager with surprising gentleness. They existed in a functional, silent truce. Then, on Thursday afternoon, the heart monitor changed its rhythm. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic flatline. It was a gradual, creeping acceleration. The steady beep-beep morphed into a frantic, high-pitched trill. Camilla dropped the half-eaten protein bar she was chewing and bolted into the room. Nico's skin was flushed, mottled with an ugly greyish undertone. He was thrashing weakly against the restraints she had loosely applied to keep him from ripping his own stitches out. She grabbed the thermometer. 104.1. Damn it, Camilla hissed. She pressed her stethoscope to his chest. His lungs sounded wet. A deep-seated infection had taken hold, bypassing the standard antibiotics she had been pushing through his line. Peritonitis. The bowel repair was leaking, or his body was simply giving up the fight. What is it? Leo was suddenly in the doorway, blocking out the harsh fluorescent light of the hallway. Sepsis. He's cooking from the inside out, Camilla said, her hands flying over the medical cart. She tore open an alcohol swab with her teeth. The cefazolin isn't touching it. I need meropenem, and I need it 10 minutes ago. She yanked open the bottom drawer of her pharmaceutical cabinet. Empty. She pulled the next one. Empty. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked through her exhaustion. Her grey market supplier in Detroit was supposed to drop off a new shipment yesterday, but he had ghosted her. Nico groaned, a low, wet sound that rattled in his throat. I don't have it, Camilla said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. She turned to Leo. I need a hospital pharmacy. Now. Leo didn't move. No hospitals. Boss's orders. He's going to die on this table in 2 hours if I don't nuke this infection, she shouted, slamming her hand against the metal cart. The instruments rattled violently. I don't care about your boss's orders. Get him in the car. Leo stared at her, his broad face impassive. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a burner phone. He hit a single button and put it to his ear. Kid is burning up, Leo said into the receiver. Doc says she needs... He looked at Camilla. Meropenem, IV drip, and a broad-spectrum antifungal just in case, she rattled off, her voice shaking slightly with adrenaline. Meropenem, Leo repeated. Yeah, we're holding. He ended the call. What do you mean, holding? Camilla demanded, turning back to Nico to pack his groin and armpits with ice packs. We don't have time to hold. Boss is on it. 30 agonizing minutes passed. Camilla pushed fluids, trying desperately to keep Nico's blood pressure from completely bottoming out. She watched the monitor, counting every frantic heartbeat, her own pulse roaring in her ears. She felt the heavy, suffocating weight of failure pressing down on her shoulders. This was why she hated the basement. In a real trauma ward, she would have had a team. She would have had an infectious disease specialist. Here, she just had a mobster reading a Louis L'Amour novel. The heavy iron buzzer rang. Leo was at the steel door in a second, peering through the camera feed. He threw the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Dante walked in. He wore a dark charcoal suit, devoid of a tie, his jaw tight. He didn't look at Leo. He walked straight into the operating room, carrying a heavy, unmarked white paper bag. He set it on the surgical tray. Meropenem, Dante said, his voice flat and calm. And 6 other things the pharmacist threw in the bag when I told him to empty the safe. Camilla didn't ask how he got a pharmacist to open a safe at 3 in the afternoon. She ripped the bag open. Inside were neatly stacked vials of the exact antibiotic she needed, along with saline bags and sterile tubing. You robbed a pharmacy, she stated, her hands already moving to prep the syringe. I made a heavily coerced donation to a private clinic in the suburbs, Dante corrected smoothly. He stepped back, giving her room to work, but his eyes never left her. Fix him, doctor. Camilla drew the medication into the syringe, tapped the air bubbles out, and injected it directly into the port of Nico's IV line. She adjusted the drip rate, her hands moving with a practiced, desperate precision. Now, there was nothing to do but wait. She stood by the table, her chest heaving, staring at the monitor. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Slowly, agonizingly, the frantic trill of the heartbeat began to space out. The numbers on the screen stabilized. 108. Then 102.5. Camilla let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for an hour. Her knees suddenly felt like water. She gripped the edge of the surgical table to keep from swaying. A hand wrapped around her upper arm. It was a familiar, anchoring grip. Dante steered her away from the table, pulling her out of the operating room and into her small office. He pressed her down onto the battered leather sofa. Breathe, he ordered softly. Camilla dropped her head into her hands. The adrenaline was draining out of her, leaving a hollow, aching void in its wake. He's just a kid, she whispered. "He's alive," Dante said. He crouched down in front of her, forcing her to look at him. The metallic grey of his eyes held a strange, intense focus. "Because you didn't panic. Because you held the line. Because you brought the drugs," she countered bitterly. "I handle the logistics. You handle the blood." Dante reached out, his thumb catching a smear of Nico's blood on her cheek. He wiped it away, his touch burning against her cold skin. "You belong exactly where you are, Camilla." Nico left on a Tuesday. He was pale, 20 pounds lighter, and walking with a heavy shuffle, but he was vertical. Leo loaded him into the back of a black SUV idling in the alley. The teenager offered Camilla a weak nod before the tinted windows rolled up, swallowing him whole. When the taillights faded, the basement suddenly felt cavernous and entirely too quiet. Camilla spent the next 3 hours sanitizing the clinic. She scrubbed the linoleum until her knuckles ached, desperate to remove the lingering phantom smell of peritonitis and stale sweat. She was exhausted, but it was a wired, jittery kind of exhaustion. The adrenaline of the past week refused to fully leave her system. She was packing her duffel bag, intent on finally going to her actual apartment to sleep in a bed that didn't smell like antiseptic when the heavy steel door unlatched. She jumped, her hand instinctively dropping to the heavy medical shears on the desk. Dante Costa stepped into the entryway. He wasn't flanked by Leo or any of his other shadows. He was alone. He wore a dark navy coat over a fitted black sweater, looking like a high-end catalogue model who casually ruined lives on the weekend. "The boy is settled at a safe house," Dante said, reading the question on her face. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her pack. "He'll make a full recovery." "Good. My invoice for the week is on the desk," Camilla said, shoving a clean pair of scrubs into her bag. "I'm going home." "No, you're not." Camilla stopped, her hand gripping the zipper. She looked up at him, her cynical defense mechanism instantly snapping into place. "Excuse me, the patient is gone. My shift is over. I don't live in this bunker. You haven't eaten a real meal in 6 days, and you look like you're going to collapse," Dante observed, his tone infuriatingly even. "You're not driving. Grab your coat." "I'm perfectly capable of calling a cab." "Camilla." His voice dropped, losing the conversational lightness. It was the same tone he had used to quiet his men at Lombra. It wasn't a request. 10 minutes later, she was sitting in the passenger seat of a sleek, armored Mercedes. The interior smelled of expensive leather and that omnipresent hint of vetiver. She stared out the window, watching the gritty streets of her neighborhood blur into the polished, towering glass of the downtown district. He didn't take her to a mob hangout. He pulled into a private underground garage beneath a luxury high-rise. They took a dedicated elevator up to the top floor, stepping out into a breathtaking, dimly lit restaurant that overlooked the sprawling, glittering grid of Chicago. The place was entirely empty, save for a single waiter standing at attention near a corner booth. "You bought out the restaurant?" Camilla asked, feeling aggressively underdressed in her jeans and heavy boots. "I own the building," Dante corrected, guiding her to the booth with a light hand on the small of her back. The touch was brief, but it sent a traitorous shiver down her spine. "Sit. Eat." The food arrived almost instantly. Hand-rolled tortellini in a rich truffle cream sauce, seared scallops, and a heavy, dark red wine. Camilla wanted to refuse it out of spite, but her stomach betrayed her with a loud, hollow rumble. She picked up her fork. Dante didn't eat. He sat across from her, a glass of water in his hand, entirely focused on watching her dismantle the meal. It was unnerving. He watched her the way a predator watches a very interesting bird. "So," Dante finally said, breaking the silence as she finished her first plate. "Dr. Rossi, graduated top of your class at Northwestern, completed your surgical residency with honors, You were on track to be the youngest attending trauma surgeon at Chicago Med. Camilla froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. She slowly lowered it to the table. You read my file? I read everything, Dante replied calmly. What I couldn't find in the public record was why a woman with your pedigree is slicing bullets out of gangsters in a basement for cash. She reached for the wine, taking a long, deep swallow. The alcohol burned pleasantly down her throat. The public record says I was terminated for gross insubordination and violating hospital protocols. I know what the record says. I'm asking you. Camilla looked out the window. The city looked beautiful from up here. Clean, distant, completely divorced from the blood and the grit she scrubbed out of her floorboards every day. A 16-year-old kid came into the ER, she started, her voice flattening out as she detached from the memory. Gunshot wound to the chest, no insurance, no ID. The attending on call took one look at him and ordered him stabilized and transferred to county. Protocol for indigent John does. Dante listened, his expression unreadable. He was bleeding out. He wouldn't have survived the 20-minute ambulance ride. Camilla continued, looking back at him. Her eyes were hard. I bypassed the attending. I forged a consent form, took him into an empty OR, and cracked his chest. I found the bleeder. I fixed it. You saved him. He died 3 hours later in the ICU from a secondary stroke, she corrected bitterly. The hospital board needed a scapegoat to avoid a massive malpractice lawsuit from the family, who miraculously materialized the second he died. The attending threw me to the wolves. They stripped my license. Dante absorbed this. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the white linen tablecloth. You broke the rules for someone who didn't matter to the system. I did my job, and the system punished you for it, Dante murmured. He reached across the table. He didn't touch her hand, but his fingers rested inches from hers. You operate in the shadows now because the light rejected you. We have that in common. We have nothing in common, Camilla said sharply, pulling her hand back. You break rules for power. I broke them to save a life. Dante smiled. It was a cold, sharp thing. Tell yourself whatever you need to, Camilla. But you didn't flinch when you saw my world. You didn't run when the boy started dying. You're cut from the same violent cloth I am. You just prefer to sew it back together instead of tearing it apart. The transition back to the basement was brutal. After the truffle cream and the skyline views, the clinic felt like a concrete coffin. Camilla threw herself into the mundane with aggressive intent. For 2 weeks, the underworld stayed quiet. She treated the neighborhoods discarded. She reset a dislocated shoulder for a mechanic who had slipped under a chassis. She stitched up a deep laceration on a waitress's cheek, listening to a tired, rehearsed lie about a falling cabinet door. She didn't ask questions. She just closed the wounds, took the crumpled $20 bills, and bleached the instruments. It was a Tuesday afternoon, raining with a cold, sideways persistence, when the illusion of safety shattered. Camilla was at the small scrub sink, washing a set of forceps, when the heavy iron buzzer screamed. It wasn't the rhythmic, code-like tap Leo used. It was a frantic, continuous blare. She dried her hands, her pulse immediately kicking into a higher gear. She walked down the short hallway and checked the grainy security monitor. It wasn't Leo. It was a man she didn't recognize, wearing a soaked canvas jacket. He was leaning heavily against the brick wall of the alley, clutching his side. Dark, viscous fluid was leaking between his fingers, washing away in the heavy rain. Camilla hesitated. Dante's rule had been absolute. When my men get hurt, they go to you. But this man didn't have the heavy, tailored look of Dante's crew. He looked like a street-level runner. He looked terrified. She hit the intercom button. Clinic is closed. Please, the man gasped, his voice tinny and distorted through the cheap speaker. Leo sent me. South End crew. They hit the stash house. I'm bleeding out. The mention of Leo broke her paralysis. She threw the heavy deadbolt and shoved the steel door open. The man practically fell inside, bringing the smell of wet asphalt and fresh blood with him. Camilla caught him under the arm, grunting at the sudden, dead weight. Table. Room 1. Move, she ordered, dragging him down the hall. She didn't get him to the table. Before they reached the doorway, the distinct mechanical sound of a heavy engine roared down the narrow alleyway. The man froze, his eyes widening in absolute terror. He looked back at the open steel door. "Get down!" Camilla screamed. She tackled him, driving her shoulder into his uninjured side, sending them both crashing to the hard linoleum floor. The clinic erupted. The noise was a physical entity, a deafening, overlapping roar of automatic gunfire that swallowed all the air in the basement. The heavy steel door, thick as it was, couldn't stop the barrage from the street level above. High-caliber rounds chewed through the upper foundation, sending chunks of concrete, drywall, and splintered wood raining down into the clinic. The fluorescent lights overhead exploded in a shower of sparks and broken glass, plunging the hallway into a chaotic, strobing twilight. Camilla pressed her face against the cold floor, covering her head with her arms. The dust tasted like chalk and old copper. The man beneath her was screaming, a high, thin sound that was barely audible over the destruction. It lasted for maybe 20 seconds. It felt like an hour. Then, the tires screeched, and the engine noise faded rapidly down the alley. Silence rushed back in, heavy and ringing. Camilla lay still for a long moment, waiting for the secondary attack. When nothing came, except the hiss of a busted water pipe, she pushed herself up to her knees. Her ears were ringing with a high-pitched whine. She coughed, choking on the thick drywall dust suspended in the air. "Hey!" she rasped, shaking the man beside her. "Hey, look at me!" He didn't move. A new pool of blood was expanding rapidly beneath him, soaking into the white dust on the floor. One of the rounds that had ripped through the ceiling had caught him in the neck. He was gone. Camilla stared at the body. Her hands were shaking violently. She wasn't a soldier. She was a doctor. She fixed the aftermath of the violence. She wasn't supposed to be in the middle of it. The iron buzzer at the alley door didn't ring. Instead, heavy boots crunched over the shattered glass and debris in the entryway. Camilla scrambled backward, grabbing a heavy metal IV pole, hoisting it like a makeshift spear. Her breathing was ragged, tearing at her throat. A massive silhouette stepped through the smoke and dust. "Doc?" It was Leo. He had a heavy assault rifle slung across his chest, and his suit jacket was torn, but he was upright. Camilla dropped the IV pole. It clattered loudly against the floor. She leaned back against the wall, sliding down until she was sitting on the debris-covered linoleum. She pulled her knees to her chest, trying to force oxygen into her lungs. "They followed him," Leo said, his voice grim. He stepped over the dead man, barely looking at him, and knelt in front of Camilla. His large hands gently patted her arms and shoulders, checking for holes. "You hit?" "No," Camilla managed to say, her voice shaking. "No, I'm fine." "Good." Leo stood up, shifting the rifle, "because the boss is outside, and he is not." The adrenaline that had just begun to recede flooded back into Camilla's system with violent force. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the sharp sting of glass cutting into her palms. "Where is he?" she demanded. "In the car. He caught a stray fragment outside the stash house before we got here. Driver's bringing him in." Camilla didn't wait. She ran past Leo, stepping over the dead man without a second glance, and practically tore the ruined steel door off its hinges. The armored Mercedes was parked diagonally across the alley, its engine idling with a low, menacing growl. The back door swung open, and Dante stepped out. He looked furious. His dark coat was missing, and the left sleeve of his crisp white shirt was soaked in a heavy, spreading crimson stain. He wasn't staggering, but his movements were rigid, deliberately controlled to mask the pain. He looked past her, taking in the shattered concrete and the smoke drifting out of the clinic door. His jaw tightened so hard, Camilla thought she heard the bone crack. "Inside," Camilla ordered, slipping her arm around his uninjured side. "I can walk," Dante bit out, though he leaned heavily against her as they navigated the debris in the hallway. "Shut up and walk faster," she snapped back. She bypassed room 1, which was covered in dust and shattered glass, and kicked open the door to the secondary operating room. She flipped the emergency generator switch on the wall. A harsh, yellow backup light flickered to life, casting deep shadows across the room. "Sit on the table," Camilla said, already moving toward the emergency trauma cart she kept sealed in plastic. She ripped the plastic away. "Leo, secure the perimeter. If anyone else comes down that alley, kill them." "Already on it, Doc," Leo rumbled from the hallway. Camilla turned back to Dante. He was sitting on the edge of the steel table, his right hand gripping the edge so hard his knuckles were entirely white. The blood was dripping from his fingertips, pooling on the floor. She grabbed heavy trauma shears from the tray. "I need to cut the shirt." "It's custom," Dante said, his voice tight. "I'll bill you for a new one," Camilla replied. She didn't wait for permission. She slid the cold metal of the shears under the expensive fabric and cut cleanly up the sleeve, then across the collarbone, peeling the ruined fabric away from his skin. He was heavily muscled, his chest and stomach crisscrossed with faded, silver scars that told a long history of violence. But Camilla's focus was solely on the jagged, bleeding tear in his left deltoid. It wasn't a clean bullet hole. It was a massive laceration, torn open by a piece of fragmented metal or concrete. Shrapnel, Camilla assessed, her clinical detachment instantly taking over. The panic of the shootout vanished, replaced by the cold, mechanical logic of anatomy. It missed the brachial artery, but the muscle is shredded. I have to clean it out before I close it, or you'll lose the arm to infection. "Do it," Dante said, not looking at the wound. He was looking at her. "I don't have time to push a local anesthetic. The generators only run the lights. I can't power the monitors. You're going to feel this." I said, "Do it, Camilla." She grabbed a bottle of surgical iodine and a handful of sterile gauze. "Bite down on something." Dante didn't. He just maintained his unblinking stare. Camilla poured the iodine directly into the open wound. Dante's entire body went rigid. A sharp hiss escaped through his teeth, and the muscles in his jaw corded, but he didn't pull away. He didn't even flinch. She worked fast, picking out tiny, jagged pieces of metal and debris with forceps, flushing the wound repeatedly. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the metallic clink of instruments hitting the surgical tray and the ragged sound of Dante's breathing. "They crossed a line today," Dante said suddenly. His voice was raw, scraped hollow by the pain. "Don't talk! It raises your heart rate and makes you bleed faster," Camilla ordered, threading a curved needle with thick, black suture wire. "They didn't just hit my stash house," he continued, ignoring her. "They followed my man here. They shot up your clinic." "I noticed," she said dryly, tying off the first stitch with a sharp tug. Dante's breath hitched. "They know about you." Camilla froze. The needle hovered above his torn flesh. She looked up, meeting his eyes. The grey irises were dark, dilated from the pain and adrenaline. "You're the ghost," Dante said quietly, the intensity in his voice pinning her to the spot. They know I have someone putting my men back together. They want to cut my supply line. They want to kill my anchor. The reality of the situation crashed over her. She wasn't a neutral party anymore. She wasn't just a doctor providing a service in a basement. To the South End crew, she was a piece of Dante Costa's machinery. And in war, you destroy the machinery. "I'll have Leo pack your things," Dante said. He reached out with his right hand, his warm, blood-stained fingers wrapping firmly around her wrist. "You're moving into the penthouse." "I am not living with you," Camilla said, her voice trembling slightly. She tried to pull her wrist away, but his grip was unyielding. "You don't have a choice anymore, Camilla," Dante stated, his tone carrying the absolute weight of a verdict. "You can't walk away. They will find you. You are mine to protect now, and I do not lose what is mine." She stared at him, feeling the trap finally spring shut. She had thought she was manipulating the system, taking Mafia money to fund her own redemption. But Dante had pulled her deep into his orbit, and now there was no escaping the gravity. She looked down at the needle in her hand, then back up at the mob boss, who was bleeding on her table. "Let go of my wrist," Camilla said, her voice turning cold and professional once more. "I need to finish these stitches." Dante studied her face for a long moment. Then, slowly, the corner of his mouth curved up into a dark, knowing grin. He released her wrist. "Take your time, Doctor," he murmured. "We have all night." The clinic was dead. Camilla stood in the center of the debris, a heavy canvas duffel bag slung over her shoulder. The backup generator hummed a low, dying note. Grey drywall dust settled over the stainless steel tray, coating the bloodstains on the floor in a pale, chalky film. She had spent the last 2 hours packing everything of value: scalpels, remaining antibiotics, surgical mesh, and the heavy titanium clamps she had bought on the black market. She wasn't leaving her tools behind for the cops to inventory. Leo waited by the ruined steel door, holding 2 massive Pelican cases filled with her monitoring equipment. He didn't rush her. The massive enforcer just stood in the shadows, his rifle hanging loosely at his side, watching the street level above. "We're clear, Doc," Leo rumbled. Camilla took one last look at the room where she had spent the last 8 months of her life. It was a miserable, windowless box that smelled of bleach and regret. She didn't feel an ounce of sorrow leaving it. She turned on her heel and walked out. The rain was coming down in thick, freezing sheets as they loaded the gear into a secondary SUV. Dante was already gone, whisked away in the armored Mercedes while she packed. Camilla climbed into the passenger seat next to Leo. She didn't look back as they pulled out of the alley. The drive through the city was a blur of neon streaks on wet glass. Camilla leaned her head against the cold window, the exhaustion finally catching up to her. Her hands were bruised, her boots were ruined, and she was technically an accessory to a gangland shootout. The cynical, rational part of her brain told her to demand Leo pull over, get out of the car, and buy a bus ticket to a state where nobody knew her face. But Dante was right. The South End crew knew about the ghost doctor. A bus ticket wouldn't save her from a bullet in a terminal. 20 minutes later, the SUV descended into the private underground garage of Dante's high-rise. Leo carried the heavy cases into the private elevator. He scanned his thumbprint, and the doors slid shut, rocketing them upward. The doors chimed and parted, revealing the penthouse. It was a sprawling expanse of polished concrete, dark wood, and floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a staggering 360-degree view of the Chicago skyline. It was silent, sterile, and aggressively expensive. Dante was standing by the massive window facing the lake. He wore a fresh pair of dark trousers and a loose black silk shirt, left unbuttoned at the top to accommodate the thick white bandages wrapping his left shoulder. He held a heavy crystal glass of amber liquid in his right hand. Leo set the cases by the door and vanished back into the elevator without a word. Camilla dropped her duffel bag onto the hardwood floor. The heavy thud echoed through the massive room. She stepped out of her muddy boots, leaving them aggressively on a pristine white rug, and walked toward him. "You need to ice that shoulder," she said, her voice flat. "The inflammation is going to peak in about 4 hours." Dante didn't turn around. He took a slow sip of his whiskey. "I have a high tolerance for discomfort." "Inflammation doesn't care about your tolerance. It compromises the sutures," she countered, stopping a few feet behind him. He finally turned. His face was pale from the blood loss, but the hard, predatory light in his grey eyes remained untouched. He looked at her bare feet, her dust-covered jeans, and the sheer exhaustion etched into the lines of her face. "The guest wing is down the hall to the left," Dante said, gesturing with the glass. "There's a walk-in shower. Clothes that should fit you. Sleep. Tomorrow, we figure out the rest." "No," Camilla said. She crossed her arms, ignoring the ache in her own shoulders. "We figure it out right now." Dante raised an eyebrow. "You're in no condition to negotiate. I am the only one keeping your men vertical, which means I hold all the leverage." She snapped back. She took a step closer, invading his space. "I am not your prisoner, Dante. I am not a pet you keep locked in a glass tower so your enemies can't get to me. If I am staying here, this isn't a safe house. It's a base of operations." Dante went very still. "Meaning what, exactly?" "Meaning I want the East Wing," Camilla demanded, pointing vaguely across the massive apartment. "I want it gutted. I want a sterile environment. I want an operating table with a hydraulic lift, overhead surgical lights, and an autonomous power supply. I want a fully stocked pharmacy vault, and I want an MRI machine. If you want a ghost surgeon, you are going to fund a ghost hospital." Silence stretched between them. The rain lashed against the thick glass of the windows, a heavy, rhythmic drumming. Dante stared down at her. He studied the fierce, unyielding set of her jaw. She was covered in concrete dust and other men's blood, standing in his pristine penthouse, making demands that would cost him millions. Slowly, the tension in his shoulders released. A genuine, dark laugh escaped his chest, rich and dangerous. "An MRI machine," Dante repeated, shaking his head. He set his whiskey glass down on a nearby console table. He reached out with his uninjured arm, wrapping his hand around the back of her neck. His grip was firm, warm, and entirely possessive. He pulled her a fraction of an inch closer. "You are terrifying, Doctor." "I am practical," Camilla corrected, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't pull away from his touch. "You are exactly what I need," Dante murmured, his thumb brushing the pulse point on her neck. His gaze dropped to her lips, then back up to her eyes. The pretense of the contractor and the client was dead, buried in the rubble of the basement clinic. "You have your hospital, Camilla. I'll have the contractors here tomorrow." "Good." Dante leaned down, his face inches from hers, the scent of vetiver and expensive whiskey wrapping around her. "Now," Dante whispered, a wicked, knowing grin touching his lips. "Say it again, just like you did in the club." Camilla looked up into his cold, metallic eyes. She felt the absolute danger radiating off him, the sheer violence of his world, and for the first time, she didn't want to run from it. She wanted to anchor it. "Cornutu e maluminutu," she whispered back. Dante pulled her in, and the city burned silently behind them. That wraps up the gripping story of Camilla and Dante. From a desperate, exhausted doctor in a basement clinic to the untouchable anchor of a Mafia empire, Camilla proved that true power isn't just about pulling the trigger. It's about holding the only needle that can fix the damage.